Victorian Bayswater. Chapter 6. St. Matthew's Infant School. When my father was 5 years old, he went up to the junior school of St. Matthew's Church, which was in another building, also in Queen's Road. It was only Class 1 that had a separate room, and known as the bottom standard. There he was taught the prayer book, and at the same time instruction was given so that the pupils could recite the 10 Commandments, the Creed, the Catechism, and the Lord's Prayer, and this was to prepare them for confirmation. In subsequent years the higher standards were taught in a large hall, which seated about 5 classes. The head teacher was Mr. Dexter, who had an assistant and 3 female staff. Boys were separated from girls, who had their own hall, and at this time education wasn't compulsory. There was a voluntary charge made throughout the year of 2d per week for lessons. Discipline was vigorously exercised to keep noise levels down, so that it was not able to disturb other classes. Lessons arranged so that singing in one class was taught, with sewing and drawing in another, so that one wouldn't affect the other. These large rooms or halls were very cold in the winter, for they had large windows and lofty ceilings, and each large room had a coal heater set in the middle of the floor, with the chimney pipe running up to the high roof. The floor, uneven through use, showed raised nails, and was bare of bare wood, which gave off clouds of dust when anyone moved. Colourless, flaking, lime-washed walls white peppered the surrounding floor, which added to the general dust. My father spoke of the severe winters and dense fogs, which made going to school something to be dreaded. In the winter of 1894 to 95, which was particularly severe, hot meals were provided, and warm clothing distributed to the needy, and boots to those without. It was reported by the school's medical officer that at least 1/3 of all children hadn't had their clothes off for more than 6 months, and that a high percentage of these had their underclothes sewn on them. These children smelt. Nobody wanted to sit next to them, and others continually itched and couldn't sit still. Schoolrooms were fumigated, and teachers wore bags of sulphur sewn into their hems to ward off vermin. A great many children worked before and after school as messengers, street sellers, and errand boys. It was a case of having to provide for a single or sickly parent. For 12-year-old girls leaving school, domestic service was the most popular job available. Many of the children were fed by charitable funds provided by rich neighbours and philanthropic action by societies. It was only at the start of the First World War that the Board of Education compelled all authorities to provide meals. The health of school children was a matter of concern, and provision made for the medical inspection of all school children, and by 1914 just over 3/4 of London's boroughs made health, eyesight and dental checks a positive action. The improved provision of continuous tap water helped children's health, and skin complaints began to disappear, and infections from various bugs reduced to the degree that fumigation tailed off. These were dreary winter days when the teacher lit the gas mantle held in the wall bracket to produce a depressing yellow glow. This light could hardly penetrate the gloom, not only because of the lateness of the hour, but the denseness of the London fog outside, which seeped into the room. It's now difficult to imagine, although understandable when we consider their Mondays, in particular when all the boilers were lit for washing. It was difficult to breathe the sulphurous air. The fumes from candles, oil lamps, and various heaters made even the outside of homes smoky. To go out was a trial, continually tripping over milk churns and dustbins, negotiating horse dung and rotting waste, into a world of a pale golden colour with humps and hillocks, ghostly bodies set lurching into each other, all groping to find their way. The high-hung school bell set on the roof rang at 9 and 1 o'clock. The children had to form up outside until let in to form queues that were led snaking into the classrooms. There was no talking, no running. Every movement was regimented and orderly. Slates were used to write on, which made a squeaky noise when the slate pencils were used. No provision was made for cleaning the slates, so the children spat on them and rubbed them with their sleeves. Slates hung from pegs around the wall were used for minor lessons and practice to save paper, and when writing perfected, using slates, writing books, and pens and ink sets passed out by the monitor. By the turn of the century, a system of elementary education had been worked out, and some 2 million children attended board school. And this was the direct result of the 1870 Education Act coming into fruition. All of England was divided up into school districts where school boards were set up with powers to levy rates and build schools, and this was done, and the results can be seen today. Those schools are still in being, although perhaps not as schools anymore. The Education Act of 1902 was the basis for all branches of education, from elementary to university. Included in this were church schools, county districts and borough councils, who formed local education committees, LEAs, replaced school boards, and by the end of 1902 53 secondary schools were set up, and it took a further 10 years to add 300 more. The working population of large British cities, particularly London at the turn of the 19th century, were described geographically by Dickens' novels. They were peopled, intent upon holding their jobs, maintaining the positions in the social order, and putting on a brave face to cover up any differences of order or hardship. And amongst these citizens were the Carey family, one of many who succeeded. They eventually considered themselves Londoners and were proud of it. And in addition, what was different about them was, from many such families, that their paternal great-grandfather Thomas Carey had been born in Ireland of ancient Gaelic roots. My father was very aware that he was fortunate. His father had a skilled job which enabled him to be self-employed, and this was at a time when a number of events in both Britain and the rest of the world came one after another to create the industrial society. Steam engines were invented to pump out water from the mines, allowing more coal to be extracted. This power source was adapted to drive mills and traction engines. Canals were built to move the heavy materials across country, mainly coal. Railways took over the transportation of goods and passengers. And this movement of people stripped young people away from the countryside. Houses, factories, railway cuttings, tunnels and docks had to be provided. To clothe, equip, furnish and supply the factories and their workers, ancillary businesses blossomed. And once this train of events happened, there was no stopping the development of a new industrial society that had far-reaching social effects. Into the birth of this new world, Thomas galloped to start a new life, and eventually generations of Londoners. His son Thomas took over the reins to pass them to my grandfather, who benefited from the building boom, allowing him to start up his own business. My grandmother also ran her own business. The laundry operated from home and provided work for local women. And once again it was an opportune time to own such an enterprise, especially in the middle-class area of Bayswater. It too prospered. This was a loving, secure home environment which provided my father with grounding for organisation and management. As there was already a piano in the house, it wasn't difficult to accord him that desire, and it didn't take him long to reach the first grade, and his teacher declared that he had a natural bent, learning not only the practical side but the theory too. and soon he was able to play the hymns sung at the school assembly. He was often required to accompany singers at Christmas time, and within a few years diligent practice proficient enough to play for the local film show, keeping pace with the black and white films. He continued to play for the rest of his life, reaching a high enough standard to play for Masonic meetings. To have a piano in the house at the turn of the 19th century was the popular means of home entertainment. It's estimated that there were between 2 and 4 million pianos in Britain, one instrument to 10 to 20 people. It was a skill considered to be one of a social inclusion, especially for girls. To be able to play well, able to accompany singers, entertaining company, a mark of distinction. It was also a guarantee of inclusion, for a skilled player was always wanted for every social gathering. The piano in the parlour was not just a butt for jokes, but a matter of fact, and between 1877 and 1902 the Lost Chord sold 50,000 copies of sheet music per year, making Parry a very rich man. The family sing-song around the piano, singing the songs of the day from popular music hall acts, operettas, national tunes and hymns, were looked forward to as a means of social discourse, bringing family and friends together. And even during the Second World War, every weekend it was my task to gather the music together, sort out the tunes to be sung, and prepare the piano, making sure the action had been aired, was free from damp before the fire. I had to sing my party piece before visiting aunts and uncles. Cherry Ripe, The Tree, The Miner's Dream of Home, and The Teddy Bear's Picnic, my father with The Village Pump and Captain Ginger, and a selection from Gilbert and Sullivan. My father stayed at school until he was 7 years old, when the family moved to Kensal Green. His next school, Princess Frederica High Grade School, had the sexes still separated. He tells us that it was a miserable place, staffed by elderly teachers who were always unsmiling, stern, and dressed as if in mourning. He was glad when he moved yet again to the London School Board at Amberley Road, Paddington. And this school is still there, and backs onto the Paddington branch of the Grand Union Canal. One end of the road is Harrow Road in Westbourne Green. Whilst my father attended this school, Queen Victoria died, and Edward VII was crowned king. All children were given the day off to celebrate, and street parties were arranged. And later that year my father joined the 6th London Company Boys' Brigade, which was attached to the school's church. The Boy Scouts were based upon trekking and scouting. The Boys' Brigade were linked to a military style of light infantry training. The Boys' Brigade were founded by Sir William Smith in Glasgow at the end of the 19th century. The object of the brigade was to produce good citizens, and in 1904 throughout the country there were said to be 54,000 boys between the ages of 12 and 14 in the organisation. Baden-Powell became Honorary Vice President and Inspector General that same year, and it was thought by many, both in the army and government, that here was an organisation that could be a source of recruitment for future officers and men of the British Army. A strong force behind the Volunteers and the Army, a third line in defending our shores. Now at last my father was happy. The headmaster at the London School Board was Mr. Williamson, who, although strict, was kind and fortunately ably assisted by capable teachers in 6 separate classrooms. My father could master the 3 R's and was taught elementary algebra, composition, drawing, geometry, French and woodwork. He had a great affection for this school and never forgot the headmaster, what he owed him for his many kindnesses. Discipline was looked on as something essential and necessary, and so too punishments by wrongdoing and slackness. There was a punishment book called the School Board Book, cane, and a punishment book. The children with great awe regarded this, and so the threat of entry into this book was sufficient to deter misdoing. At the start of every day prayers were said and hymns sung in the main hall, and at the end of each day the same thing happened. Pupils were expected to pay respect to older people, hats should be raised and taken off to masters and mistresses, to say sir and miss when spoken to, and when leaving school caps were to be worn at all times. Father played the piano for the school assembly, and in the evenings for the local picture palace, where silent films with subtitles were shown, and this required dexterity and a knowledge of many tunes to follow each part of the storyline. English lessons, which were taught every day, had as their main content the spelling of words and note-taking. Writing with a hand in copperplate script was the standard necessary, and much practised. Mental arithmetic was greatly encouraged by giving every class every day a problem to be solved. Teachers taught all subjects and knew their charges intimately, their faults and failings, their successes and strengths. In 1900 the Underground Railway system was electrified, and for the price of a twopenny ticket the passenger could travel as far as he wished. This became so successful that the Underground Railway was extended, which in turn paid its way. The first transatlantic wireless message was sent the following year, and the industrialization continued apace each year that passed, more inventions and discoveries being made. My father started work at the age of 15, in 1904, the same time the Russian-Japanese War started. He joined the Great Central Railway Company, whose head office was at Paddington Station, as a junior clerk, and because there was no vacancy at this post to start with, he had to serve out his probationary period learning to pack parcels and load wagons in the goods yard. A few months later, a vacancy for junior clerk occurred on the staff of Thompson, Mackay and Company, who were carting agents for the Grand Central Railway, which he took. Office work included dealing with street accidents, claims for damages to goods in carriage, stoppages, overtime and bonus payments, accounts, detention charges, correspondence and ordering feed for the horses. And in retrospect, if my father had waited for a vacancy with the railway company and not gone to a private cartage company, he would have benefited enormously, both in eventual retirement benefit and rising in the far larger concern. The cartage department then came under the jurisdiction of the district manager, who had 600 horses, a Miles Daimler 5-ton iron-tired motor with a rack and pinion drive and a 10-ton Yorkshire steam wagon. All the horses were young and some had to be trained. Some carmen, the term used for drivers, was detailed off as young horse carmen for breaking in these animals, and as agents Thompson, Mackay and Co. carried out town cartage work as well as more general work, particularly orders for Lots Road electric generation station, which was a speciality work, some being very heavy. In cases where the cartage of 40-ton boilers were necessary, 20 horses were used at a time, pulling a special heavy-duty wagon. Steam engines were invented to drive pumps and move heavy goods for the mining industry at the turn of the 18th century, and by 1903 Ford had built his first petrol-driven motor car, and the first steam tractors for farm and road work were designed. My father enjoyed his work and was interested in learning more about his normal duties, and by this time his various tasks included visiting local markets and the docks and learning how to service extra heavy loads. This started his never-ending love for London, its streets and all the businesses which went on within its boundaries. He did anything which would help his career and increase his knowledge of the cartage industry. Gradually, more and more motors were obtained to deal with the increased workload. Drivers had to service their own motors, and for this parts and lubricants had to be ordered in. And throughout this period he kept abreast of all the latest methods adopted to transport goods, for a personal interest drove every vehicle and got to know its workings. It was now just 3 years after the end of the Boer War. Previously Britain had invested the empire with a rosy glow, and after the war the glow was not quite so warm. Although the period was one of growth, the necessity for putting back what the war had drained away, the change in society not quite as large as that experienced after the Second World War, was large. The people didn't have more, and there was a definite improvement in the nation's health. Nevertheless, there was a feeling that the golden age of Victorian Britain was over. Most of the middle and upper classes were quite prepared to tolerate extremes of poverty so that they could indulge themselves in luxury. The working class saw the need for communal action to improve society, and Britain's economy and growth had been greater and faster than at any other time. As time has gone by, it becomes even clearer now how substantial these changes had been, when as individual groups or even country produce such wealth it becomes envied, produces a jealous reaction. The Second World War in this case was the result.